Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Right. I'm Egberto Willies. Folks, we have a treat for you today. We are with the one and only Edgar Villanueva. Edgar Villanueva is a globally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy. He serves as board chair of directors of Native Americans in Philanthropy. He's also a board member to the Edgars Family Fund, a national foundation that works to improve outcomes for the vulnerable youth. Edgar currently serves as vice president of programs and advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, where he oversees grant investments and capacity building for educational justice campaigns across the United States. Has also recently teamed up with How to Get Away with Murder actor and racial justice activist Matt McGurry for the Power to Give, a night of decolonizing wealth to connect Hollywood actors and activists to movement building work across the U.S. Edgar Villanueva, welcome to Politics Done Right, sir.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on.
Look, it seems like you've been a kind of a busy guy.
Yeah, I have definitely, as my mother would say, there's no grass growing under my feet.
I tell you what, I don't even know. I've written a couple of books, and I'm on my third, and I just can't get past chapter 4. I don't see how you got the time to do what you're doing right now. So, commendations, my friend.
Thank you.
Now, tell me a little bit about. First of all, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am originally from North Carolina. I'm an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, which is a Native American tribe in southeastern North Carolina. We have about 60,000 members of our community. And so that's sort of the perspective and community that I come from. And I have been a person that has, raised by a very strong mother, a single mother who was a service provider. She was a domestic worker and really instilled in me a desire to give back and to be of service to others. And this idea of philanthropy, of community, although we didn't have a lot of financial resources, we were rich with relationships. And that is, something that has guided me throughout the work that I do in the nonprofit sector. As an adult, most of my career has been in institutional philanthropy, which is this sector where wealthy folks and corporations start foundations to fund nonprofit organizations. And I'm a very rare commodity, so to speak, in that space, often where I'm coming from a background of poverty and being a person of color, finding myself in leadership in that space. And those are the issues that I write about. And I'm just very passionate about moving financial resources and investment back into communities of color. So that's pretty much who I am in a nutshell.
Well, I mean, you raised in that one little prose, you raised something that really I think we need to kind of put a point on. You spoke about philanthropy. First of all, what does philanthropy mean to you?
So, philanthropy to me personally is being, I think of this indigenous worldview or this saying around all my relations. And it's an inherent belief that we are all connected. So you are my relative. We are connected to each other and we are connected to the planet. And so we have a responsibility and a privilege to care for one another. Literally, the word philanthropy in the Latin means love of mankind. And so it is simply about love for me.
Well, I mean, the reason I said that is whenever a lot of people these days hear philanthropy, they think about a very rich person with capital, with cash. And one thing I noticed in one of the bios I read about you is that you considered your mother a real philanthropist. And, I figured when I started reading it, I figured, oh, here I go. I'm interviewing this guy who's going to tell all these rich people that they're doing it all wrong. And he's some rich guy coming along to do something. And then I realized that the philanthropy that you're talking about is the works performed by your mother made her philanthropic. Tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So my mother is absolutely a person that did not have financial resources. She is actually still a domestic worker and has a career that she's very proud of and is, finds dignity in that work. But I don't come from a family with wealth. We think of being in service to community and giving back to others as a responsibility that we have as residents of this world. Just being good folks in community, loving on each other, caring for each other. But the way that we think of philanthropy, as you described, as rich folk who write checks to charities in a way that's transactional, is not the way that my community sees philanthropy. In fact, if you go into many Native communities and you talk to elders in those communities and you say, what is the word philanthropy? It's not even a word that they've heard or that they might be familiar with. And so it's really thinking about beyond financial resources and writing a check, are there other ways that we can give back that are much more relational and help build community with each other and to tear down this paradigm of the us versus them?
Great. All right. Tell me a little bit about you have a new book out,
Hmm.
and
Relatively new.
relatively new. Yeah, relatively new. Okay. New for me. Okay, called Decolonizing Wealth. That's a provocative title. Why?
Provocative titles sell books. Well, it is quite provocative, and I wondered as we were going into production if we were making the right choices around that. But you know, the word decolonizing is a word that shouldn't be super triggering for people if we actually understand what we mean by decolonizing and what we mean by wealth. For me, in this book, what I tried to do is to lay out a history of how wealth has been accumulated in the United States. We live in this country in a society where wealth has been amassed, in part due to slave labor and stolen land and genocide. We have a very dark history of how wealth has been accumulated through colonization in this country that we as a community have never come to terms with. We have not had a public process of truth and reconciliation. We haven't had any official apologies from our government. And so we find ourselves present day looking at all types of social issues and seeing this huge gap in the wealth in this country of who has money and who doesn't have money. We also see major disparities around outcomes around education and economic opportunities, so forth and so on. And a lot of these problems that we're grappling with present day as a community all stem back to our history and this history of colonization. And so that's the point of this book, is like understanding the harmful effects and how the atrocity that colonization actually was on this country for indigenous people, for people of color, for black folks, but also for white folks. It's a little known fact that white folks also have experienced trauma as a result of this type of history in this country. And so understanding that history and how wealth has been amassed, I'm putting forth this idea that we need a lot of healing from this trauma. And so decolonizing is really simply about healing. It's recognizing the trauma that exists in our communities because of history and getting on a path to healing. And then knowing that money and wealth accumulation has been this thread all along this path. And so money and wealth and the accumulation of that has resulted in trauma, but we have the opportunity to use wealth and resources differently to help facilitate the healing.
Now, when I said provocative, I mean I really mean that because
Hmm.
you are postulating that, because we know all those the mega rich, except for a few like Oprah or others that we call new wealth, are really on old wealth. But I could actually draw a line towards Oprah's wealth as being one that has a negative effect as well. I mean that was built on the backs of the least as well. But I don't want to start there. How do we first approach and make the connection between today's wealthy who believe they are deserving of it, and I'm talking mostly old wealth as first, and
Hmm.
us trying to take back what was stolen?
Right. So I think of poverty. My definition of poverty is that poverty is a product of public policy and theft that has been facilitated by white supremacy. And so when we
Explain.
think about why poverty exists, right? We have to acknowledge that we have a history of public policy in this country that has allowed for wealth to be concentrated in white communities. So even when we talk about the GI Bill and some of these legislation over different policies over time that help create the middle class and help get folks ahead in this country, even within those public policies, baked into those policies were actual racist kind of components that did
Red
not
line
benefit
in.
everyone, right? So, for example, the GI Bill, right, did not apply to farm workers or domestic workers like my family and a lot of people of color who were in those professions. So, we did not benefit from the GI Bill. And so, public policy definitely has privilege, mostly white folks and people with wealth over time. When I say theft, I of course am referring to our history of slavery and genocide and extraction. Folks who have been in power and have held wealth in this country for many, many decades have benefited from that extraction and from that theft. And even if, in present day, we want to remove ourselves from those grotesque acts and maybe folks are saying, well, I just made my money in tech in the last 5 years. I have nothing to do with that. You still have to acknowledge that in this country historically, especially if you are white and you had the opportunity to go to like fantastic schools and that you have been privileged and given a leg up because of our history in this country, which leads to that part of that definition where I said this process or this product of poverty has been facilitated by white supremacy. All of our systems and policies and institutions in this country have white supremacy types of ideology baked into them that has privileged white people. And so that is why you see poverty existing in communities of color at such a much more concentrated rate because of that history, those policies, and also, frankly, because of white supremacy.
Now, you use the concept of, you talked about these philanthropic organizations that think they're doing good, but in reality, they really are, they're probably making themselves feel good as if they're doing something, as if they have the solutions. Why don't you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a very unique tax system in the United States that allows folks with wealth or corporations to start these foundations um, and get a major tax write-off, right? So there's the first win for them, and,
Hmm.
and and you might say a loss for the public. The funds that go into charitable philanthropic organizations are tax exempt. And so in the United States, that number is $900 billion. There's
Hmm.
$900 billion
Imagine that.
sitting, right? And that's money that would have gone to public education, elder care, transportation, to the safety net, things that we need as a community. Now, I'm not saying that those are bad people for starting foundations, that it's permissible by the law. I think many of those folks actually have really good intentions that, we've made this money, we want to give back. I don't think they mean any harm and actually want to help, but you have to examine and explore what is where does democracy come into play with that? That because you have a lot of money, you actually get the right to drive resources and determine how they will be invested in the community,
And
right?
that's the magic. Yes. Yes.
Versus our democratic process that we have to put those resources into, the government for those elected officials to decide. So that's one piece of it. Another important point to bring out is that with the $900 billion in charitable assets, what a lot of folks don't know is that only a small percentage of those resources actually ever leave banks and leave investment portfolios to get to community. Only about 5 to 7%. The majority of this tax exempt charitable capital is tied up in investment portfolios that are actually potentially harmful to people and to the planet. And so it makes me ask the question, what is the net value of philanthropy if we have a few dollars that we are doing good with, but the majority of our dollars are going into harmful and extractive industries?
I mean, that is so important. I mean, you remember when Mr. Smith, the billionaire, gave quite a bit of money to, I don't remember which of the black universities that he did, and
Hmm.
everybody was excited and so forth. And I took the other tact. I said, well, this guy is a guy who gets a return over 15% per year on on his investments. He decides to give $40 million to a university. First of all, that's more than $40 million worth of advertising. The goodwill, everybody loves that. So I mean, that's a hell of a profit from advertising. But here it was my biggest concern. Some of the monies that he makes hurts the same people with gentrification of the areas that he's invested in and all of that is what made the lives of many of these people more difficult. And to go ahead and then say, I'll take care of a few hundred of them, it is like getting a break for doing evil, getting a forgiveness that costs less for for what you're effecting.
No, you're right on. I think that is the truth and the reconciliation that I'm asking foundations and folks with wealth to consider. I think that, on the surface, I would like to think that he was not deliberately planning, like, oh, I need to save face, I need to change my reputation, so let me do this thing, right? But you're so right that philanthropy often is serving as a reputation builder or boost for folks with wealth who are invested in the exact systems and type and investment portfolios that are harming the very people we're trying to help. If you have those level of resources, why not think about how to get at the root causes of inequality and invest in systemic and policy changes that are going to really be transformative versus sprinkling a few dollars here and there at the problem. And so this is what you see happening time and time again with billionaires in this country. And this is why folks are calling for a moratorium on billionaires, and billionaires may feel possibly under attack. And I'm also including foundations in this conversation to consider the work that they are doing, where you have foundations under the very same roof that are funding criminal justice reform with their small percentage of grant making, but the same foundations are invested in private prisons and their through their investment portfolios. And so where's the truth in that? And we have to understand or ask ourselves, with philanthropy, are we really about trying to see transformation in our communities and use these resources and this privilege to really affect change? Or are we really just about doing some good and getting some credit and maintaining the status quo that is benefiting us, right? No millionaire, no billionaire is getting more poor because they are starting a foundation or writing this big check, right? No one is going to be less well off the following year. So these are absolutely, there's a lot of self-interest in making these contributions, if we're honest about it.
I think you're way too kind with what you think. What you think philanthropy is all about. I've always thought that philanthropy has always been self-serving, and that if a let me give another example. I think if we look at Langone and paying off the student loans for people in New York who are going to medical school. My daughter's in med school right now. She'll probably get out of school with a $500,000 worth of debt. Most doctors that are going to med school will end up with several $100,000 worth of debt. Now, Langone is a part of the problem because Langone does not support increasing tax rates across the board to help fund these type of institutions. They do not support policies like Medicare for All that will institute policies that educate doctors so that they don't have to make a $500,000 a year to save. These are the people that are. You mentioned earlier in the commentary that you just said. You said that you hope they were actually looking for systemic change. My thing is that they're not looking for systemic change. They're trying to maintain the system by putting a facade of goodness from the the facade of goodness from the capital hoarders, and in doing so, give people the less read people the belief that, oh, These deserving, wealthy people think so much of us that they are willing to help us out when the reality is we are helping them out. Their wealth got created by
Right.
us, not they. There's nothing. The fact that a Donald Trump can be a billionaire, assuming that he is, means that it doesn't take a whole lot of intellect to become a billionaire. It just takes somebody who wants to hoard capital.
You're right. I'm with you 100%. No, you're right. I think that I absolutely agree with you. And when you look at the origins of this industry, philanthropy, most foundations, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them now,
Hmm.
most of them were created in the last 10 years because wealthy folks are actually being advised by their wealth managers that they should create a foundation to have this tax shelter. And so when you look at what's happening and the origins and the history of philanthropy, with the Rockefeller Foundation and why they started up, you will see that thread all throughout. Is that in general, this industry exists to continue building wealth and to amass more wealth for the 1%, versus actually creating change in communities.
Yeah, that's important. Now, in your book, and I hadn't read, I got to this section, but there are times when a table of contents is just so well laid out that you look at it and you say, "Wow, look at those steps: grieve, apologize, listen, relate, represent, invest, and repair." I think you said there's an indigenous rule to how you can make philanthropy in a manner that really does what people think it's intended to do.
Yeah, I do. And let me just say that my approach to what I'm offering to philanthropy is an incremental approach.
Hmm.
I think that in many ways the entire industry needs to be burned down to the ground and reimagined. But I do think there are many things that we could do better under the current system. And the steps that I outline, I call them steps of healing, are for philanthropy, but they're also just for all of us as people who have are descendants of slaves or indigenous folks or even colonizers, colonial settlers. We all carry a lot of trauma and pain in our lives because of the history of this country. So the steps of healing here are for invitation for us as individuals, for us as family members, and for us as a country to think about what we need to do to get on a path to healing and truth and reconciliation. We are at a point in this country where we are so torn apart and so polarized. And I often feel that there's just no way forward to bring us together as a community. And given, the way that I came to these steps was really through looking at principles of restorative justice, which came out of an indigenous perspective or indigenous practices, and wondering if there was a way for us to apply that to our lives, and especially for those of us who move resources and move money, because money is so deeply connected to the wrongs that have been done towards folks. So that's sort of the premise behind these 7 steps to healing.
Now, have you found a great reception for the book within the philanthropic community at all?
Actually, I have, and I didn't know what was going to happen when I put it out there. If I would be blacklisted, and I will say that there's probably a couple reasons why. One is philanthropy is an extremely polite sector where we all sort of move through the world like we're good people and we don't call each other out or say things. So that's why I was a little nervous because I went there in this book and kind of spoke my truth. And so I think if there are folks who oppose the book, they're just keeping quiet because they don't want to be, not polite. But I will say overwhelmingly, though, that this book has been super well received. I have keynoted so many conferences, and the book is selling like crazy. And I know that many foundations have communicated to me how they are grappling with the material and going through their strategic planning processes. Their boards are reading the book together, and they're really trying to understand how they can get to a deeper, more intentional action beyond sort of just checking some boxes around diversity, but really examining how they can get to a place of restoring and getting into a right relationship with community. And that looks like a lot of different things. I've had, one foundation in Seattle told me they read this book and they decided to liquidate the assets of the foundation and just go out of business and return those resources back to the community. And
Wait,
we're,
you're saying your book, after they read the book, they decided to dissolve?
yes, yes, right. I was floored. So yes, that I'm a big supporter of the idea of foundations not being in perpetuity, but to consider sunsetting. And so, yeah, the board chair 2 weeks ago or so, I was at a meeting and he sought me out and he said, "I read your book. I didn't like it. I'll just be honest." And then he said, "I read it a second time, and the second time something really hit him to spark this conversation with the board about these resources." And they made a decision that there was, no need to be in perpetuity, that in the next 5 years they would spin down the foundation. Another foundation in Montreal said that they read the book and decided that they would take 10% of their assets, so not their grant making, but 10% of the corpus, and just hand that over to First Nations people there in Montreal. And so there have been very real tangible actions that folks have taken. And I think the response to the book in general speaks to an appetite for truth. I still work in philanthropy, and I'm at a conference right now as we're speaking. And folks in this work, many of them, it's not our money, but we're in this system. There
Hmm.
is a sincerity that I find often where folks want to do right with these resources and see change in communities and want to invest in communities that have been redlined. And I think the response to the book really validates that appetite, at least to begin thinking about the possibilities and to imagine what philanthropy may look like in a different way.
No, I don't think this is necessarily a part of the book, but how do we uh, the thing about it is when you have philanthropy, the thought about it is we take a look at Bill Gates. Bill Gates have several $billion, and he also has a concept, an educational concept that he believes in. So he uses his money to promote the educational concept that he believes in, and a lot of people agree with it. They love it, but most, I think, deep down, don't. It's just that he's the person with the money.
Right.
Um, Good thing, bad thing. I think it's a horrendous thing, and I think what it is not only a patriarchal thing, but an elite. I don't want to say elitist, but a thing that says, because I have capital which I earned on your back, but it's mine, I can go ahead and decide the type of educational system or the type of indoctrination system I'd like going forward.
I agree 100%. I think it is an erosion of our democracy. It's horrific. I think with people with wealth in these foundations need to consider two things. One is really turning to communities that they're interested in helping and finding a way to sincerely listen and allow those folks to decide what the solution should be and support those solutions. When we don't live in a community, and are not impacted by these issues, we have no idea what folks really need.
Right.
We can read research, we can do whatever, but it is so disrespectful to go into a community assuming that you know. There are so many ways. I mean, one way to do that, there are funds that have been started up by people of color who are connected to those communities where you could just turn over the capital. I have a fund that's called Liberated Capital, where I'm encouraging folks that are interested in supporting indigenous communities and other communities of color to just put the money here. Like, we don't need your expertise, so to speak, but we do need your capital, and we'll take it. And we will ensure that that money gets to folks in our communities that are accountable to communities, and are on the front lines of leading change. And so there are different ways, if you have wealth, to invest and give money back that are not harmful potentially to communities in a way that this education reform agenda has been.
It would be nice if more do that and not just think that because I am the owner of the capital, not the earner of the capital, but the owner of this capital, I decide how this capital is going to be disposed of. I mean, personally, I think we need a lot more regulations, government control, we the people control, given that we the people are the one who develop the wealth. Edgar Villanueva is a globally recognized expert on social justice, and he is the author of Decolonizing Wealth. It's been my pleasure, Edgar, to have you on Politics Done Right. I thank you so kindly for being here, and I hope to see what other books you're going to come up with, and it's great that you're changing the system.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on the program.